Hey everybody, this is Paige from Mosaic Moments, and today I'm giving you a full layout demo. I'm going to be showing you how to create this entire layout right here. And this layout is special because it shows two panoramas on the same layout. So let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so for today's layout, I'm using pattern number 315. This is in the strips category, so go see all of our patterns on mosaicmoments.com/patterns. Alright, I'm jumping right in today. So right here I have a piece of pattern paper to cut the largest design spot on the pattern. This is the 4x5 die from set C, and as you can see I have it in at an angle because it gives it a smoother cut versus if you put it straight through. Once you put the plates down, make sure they're all straight. So I have a magnetic plate on the bottom and then my two plates on top of that to make my sandwich here. And you want to make sure they're all really straight, because what can happen is your plate can shift in the machine. That could also potentially make your die shift and you could get a crooked cut. So make sure everything looks straight right before you cut. So I store my dies on magnetic sheets. So I'm going to place this one back next to the label that shows the correct size. So that makes it easy to find which one you need. And on the left here, I have all the layering dies, and this includes dies from the layering bundle and from the basic bundle. And I had the second largest die, so I'm going to grab one of the layering dies from over here. And I'm grabbing this one because the one from the layering set is too big for the 4x6 photo, and the other one will crop it too small for my taste. So I grabbed this size that's contained in the basic bundle. If you want to learn more about our layering dies, go check out this video in the top right corner here. So now I'm placing my die over my photo, and this is a very tight cut. You can see that the die just covers the photo here. And if you need to, I recommend using washi tape to make sure your die stays on your photo correctly. I have a magnetic plate on the very bottom of this Sizzix Big Shot machine, so that'll help keep my die in place. But for any of you who don't have a magnetic plate, I do highly recommend using washi tape to keep that die in place. Alright, so now my photo is cut to the layering size. Layering meaning it can be layered on top of the block that fits the grid paper. So keep that in mind with the basic bundle. There's the dies that fit the measurements of the grid, and then there's the dies that are measured to layer on top of those. So that is what I just used as one of the layering dies. So the next size I need is the 3x4 die. It's also in set C, and so I could quickly see which one I needed right there. And I have a piece of cardstock this time instead of pattern paper. So I placed the die over my cardstock, and as usual rolled it through the machine, and I have it in at an angle. So really important, again, I put it in at an angle because we find that so the machine cuts by pressure, and we find it distributes much better if the die is placed in at an angle. And you can hear the difference. If you put the die in straight through, you'll find it's harder to roll it through, and it'll make more cranking kind of noises. So when you put it in at an angle, you don't see that as much. Alright, and have my second one here. I needed two of the same size for my Paije pattern. So this looks really nice. And next, I'm going to put this one away first, and I'm going to also grab a layering die. Let's see, and this is the third one down. So now I'm going to look at the third group, and I have a choice here. Usually I could pick the one from the layering set or the one from the basic set. I'm going to choose the one from the layering set this time. I do, if you're on the fence about getting the layering bundle is a different size and it crops your photo a little bit bigger. And that's why I'm picking it. I feel like the dies from the basic bundle, the layering sizes, tend to crop your photos a little bit smaller than I prefer. And so I like the layering bundle because, again, it crops it a little bit bigger. And I did use the layering size from the basic bundle before, but I'm going to bring that up again later. And you'll see it still looks good. As long as your mats look even around your photograph, it looks good, even if they may not be the same size matting, we'll say, on every single part of the layout. So I'm going to show you the difference here. So this is on the right, this one was cut with a layering die from the basic bundle, and the smaller photo was cut with a die from the layering bundle. And so hopefully you can see the difference here of how much of the mat you see behind the photo. So if you have the basic bundle and find that the matting looks really big for your taste, you may want to look into the layering bundle. You can also hand cut. What the benefit of hand cutting the photos is you can make it whatever size you want, which I have done that as well. Sometimes I want my mats to be all the same around all the photos, so a lot of times in that case I might hand cut. Alright, I'm finishing up my second photo that's the same size here, and you may have noticed for this photo and the previous photo, they were printed smaller. We do have printers at our office, which is great. I find we have less waste when we have our own printers versus if I went out somewhere else to print them. So that's something to consider when using Mosaic Moments. Alright, now I'm using the grid die. Now I'm not planning to make a chunky mosaic on this layout. I am going to use these to create one of my panoramas. But this is a great die if you just need to get multiple 2x2 squares cut. So instead of the 2x2 square is in die set A in the basic bundle. And I could have cut these out one at a time with that die, but you can get 6 done all at the same time when you use this grid die. And they are attached by tabs, and I'm going to keep them together at the moment. It's especially important if this was a photograph. You don't want to get the pieces all mixed up, but I'm going to keep them together for now because it's easier to glue the back when I keep them together. Next, I have the 1x3 die from set B. So I'm just going to cut this twice. And even though it's a little die, I am putting it in at an angle. And again, it's really important to make sure your plates are going in straight. So what I mean is you have your base plate, and then you want to make sure the plastic plate on top of that is stacked so that it's not going, I guess, over or past the base plate. They should all be aligned almost perfectly, basically, because I find what happens is if they're not aligned, you roll it through the machine and then the plate starts shifting because it's trying to fit through the machine, and sometimes it makes the die shift, and I find when that happens, the cuts can be crooked, and it's very annoying because when you put it on the grid, you'll see, oh, this cut a little bit crooked. So to avoid that, keep your plates all as straight as possible. Alright, I'm speeding the video a little bit up here because I think you have the idea of how to cut with the machine, but right now I'm using the leaf silhouette die to cut this pattern paper, and I'm trying to put the scissors exactly in the middle so I have enough room for my second cut. So on the original pattern, number 315, on the top you can see 2 sections of 1x1 inch squares. Well, I wanted to fit this die in, so I'm adjusting the pattern a little bit so it'll actually have the 1x3 die size and those 2 spots. So you can always adjust your pattern. Obviously, you don't have to make it exactly the same as how you see it online. If needed, there's a certain die you want to use, like I'm doing, you can adjust the pattern to fit what you need. So just now I cut with the leaf silhouette die. It's a really cute, simple die. And now I'm using the Fir Tree die. The Fir Tree die comes with any set. So this is the 2x2 size, but the set also comes with 1x1 sizes. And if your die gets stuck, use a sharp pair of tweezers and you can poke it through one of the corners and get your die cut out. All right, So, and then I have these extra pieces and you can use them for another project. It's really handy. If you haven't seen it already, we do have grid cards, and so these extra pieces I think would be really good for cards if you don't have an opportunity to use them on another layout. So some of you want to keep your scraps, and that's what I recommend using it for, is for a grid card to give away. So I have my grid paper here, but before I start gluing down, a lot of you probably see your die cuts have these rough edges sometimes, and I really like this tool. This is the Xyron Adhesive Eraser, and you can use it to get the sticky stuff like your glue off the photos if you accidentally get it on your photos, but it's also great for getting those rough edges off. You can also use a little chiseler. And the glue I'm using is the Herma Dotto Dispenser. We really like using this brand because most repositionable glues we find, the pieces will fall off the grid paper eventually, but we find this one does stay permanent the best. So I forgot to mention, I started with the left corner. So when you're making a page pattern, I say put the piece that's in the left corner first, because some of you have a hard time figuring out like where the center of the layout is. So I think the easiest thing to do when you're following a specific page pattern is start with the left corner, and then everything else is kind of easier to figure out where to place. So I put down the focal point, which was right next to that little strip in the left corner. And I'm getting the rough edges off of this other 1x3 shape. The rest of my shapes didn't really get that. All right, I'm adding glue to the back. Just had one strip there. And I'm going to place it on this corner here. And now I can easily see where to put the next pieces because they go right underneath the 1x3 sizes. So these are the 3x4 blocks I cut with set C. Alright, so I'm going to speed up the video a little bit here because I think you get the idea. But basically, you place the pieces down based on what you see on the page pattern. And I'm not going to fill in this middle section here because that's where my strips are going to go. And I'm going to show you how I cut those in a moment. So I have the squares here I cut with the 2x2 grid die. And I just glued them down. I just find it easier to glue them down when they're in one big chunk versus if I glued every single little square. All right, now I'm going to place them in a row. So on the very bottom of this pattern, there's a row of 2x2 squares. So if you want to do a panorama, this is a great pattern if you want to fit in little 2x2 dies to your page, which I have done before, and I'm going to do on this one as well. So I have those on a row and it looks really nice. And now I can add my photos. So here's the first one, and basically you kind of have to just eyeball it. So make sure that your mat behind the photo looks even all the way around your photograph. So I'm going to do the same thing here. So as you can see, the two dies have a smaller mat than in the middle. But with the focal point, it actually looks nice to have a bigger mat sometimes because having that extra space emphasizes it more. And I do have a video about emphasis and focal points. Click on the top right corner and you can go check that out. And I give a lot of different ideas on how to create a focal point, and adding more space is one of them. So with that die, or for a photo that size, when you want to make it a little bit bigger, the dies from the layering bundle, as I said, are a little bit too big. So, but I think in the end it looks okay to have varying sizes of layering dies. So right now I'm putting on the leaf die, and I did use Xyron Create a Sticker Machine, which I love for small pieces. This was done with their really small machine. And recently I just got one that'll fit the 2x2 dies, and that one has been working really well. So I highly recommend the Xyron Create Sticker Machines. Alright, now I'm going to show you how I create my panorama. And I do like hand cutting them, and I actually have a video about how to hand cut panoramas. Go check that out in the video on the top right corner. But you can use the strip dies, but I find when I'm making a really long panorama, I do prefer hand cutting because you can align all the photos. So right now you can see they're not aligned, or not very well. Plus there is some overlapping, which when you take the photographs, I recommend to not overlap between each frame. Line up the frame, and then when you take the next picture, make sure it's a little bit past the previous frame. That'll be a lot easier for you later. So I'm going to have to trim some of these off. So what I recommend is keeping one photo whole. So the one right below my right hand is the one I'm not going to trim down at all. But the one on the left, there is a bit of overlapping, so I'm going to take out the part that overlaps with the other photo. And technically you're supposed to glue the back of your photos before placing them on the mat, but my mat's so sticky, I put my photos down without realizing they weren't glued down on the back. So just so you're aware, that happened to me while making this video, but I am going to glue the back of them in a little bit. But yeah, so that's the first step. Keep one of the photos whole. I have 4 photos here, which is quite a bit. For this panorama size, you need at least 2 4x6 photos going the landscape direction. But mine are all vertical, so I needed a little extra photographs than if I had taken them in a landscape direction. And my photo on the left is lined up right along the edge of the mat here, and I wouldn't be able to see the lines. You have to make sure your ruler lines up on the lines, and so don't put the photos right on the edge of your mat here, because then when you put the ruler down, you'll see, oh, I can't see that side of the line. Anyway, once you do it, you'll understand. So anyway, and I was gonna glue that down, but I realized I didn't glue down the other ones first, as I mentioned before. So I'm gluing them down right now. And I glue down every inch. It's going to be the same way if you make a mosaic. So you probably need a little bit more glue than normal for a panorama or a mosaic layout. So I lined my first photo on the mat. I'm going to glue down the second one here. And the nice thing about hand cutting is you can line up your photo correctly, because what happens is your camera kind of moves around and it's not perfect unless you took a panorama shot with your phone, but I didn't do that. And so I have to kind of piece it together. And so the important thing is to make sure everything lines up. So you only really need one photo that lines up on the grid lines on the mat, but the rest of them are you're just gonna make sure the horizon line matches up. So now I'm trimming down this other photo here, and it overlaps a little bit. So just take your time and make sure that you have the right space you want to cut off. This I'm gonna have to redo because I was thinking maybe I could get away with having this double leaf look, but I didn't like it, so I'm going to trim it one more time. And this happens, right? So you can always trim it down a little bit more if you need to. I'm just going to trim off 1/8. So I'm actually going to lose a little bit of the overlap. I'm sorry about the camera shaking right there. Sometimes when I'm working on something, the camera's kind of floating from the ceiling and my head will accidentally hit it. And unfortunately with these videos, it would be really difficult to go back and film that. So maybe I will get better about that, but I apologize for the camera shaking there. All right. So, and I flipped the photo over because I find it's much easier when you're hand cutting to put the ruler on the thicker side of the photo, because otherwise my ruler would have been more on the mat, and I find the ruler shifts easier when you do that. So that's why I flipped my photo over and then flipped it back. So I have some overlap with this last photo here. And what I'm going to do is make this one photo just 2 inches wide, because it's just going to be easier for me because the strips are going to be 1 inch wide. And so cutting it at 2 inches will make it easier for me to cut the strips. So you'll see that in a little bit when I get to that part. But I have 4 photos here, which is a lot more than I would prefer, and it kind of makes it a little bit awkward. So I'm only going to trim a little bit off this photo. So again, I've flipped it upside down because as you can see here, I have the ruler on more on the photo than on the mat. And I only need to cut off that little sliver. And when I have it the other way and the ruler's mainly on the cutting mat, I find the ruler moves around a lot. So I just like to flip the photo over and get rid of that little sliver. So my photos are very long, and so at the end here I still can't see the marks I need to cut the photos the the right way, so my ruler wouldn't be able to be lined up properly. And I also forgot to glue the back of this last one, so I'm doing that right now on every inch. So, and now you can see, this is why I like the hand cut, because now the whole scene is aligned correctly. So this is what I like, versus if I use the die, it would be a little more difficult. But we do have a video that tells you how to do that. So go check that out. I have a link in the top right corner. So just so you know, if you have the dies and don't want a hand cut, you can absolutely make a panorama like this with the strip dies. It's just, for me, the hand cutting is a lot easier and a lot more fun. So right now I decided to go ahead and cut each strip, because I figure on the side where the photo overlap, it covers up the edge of the grid. I figured I could cut these in the strips and I can get rid of the strips I don't want at that end. So I have the one photo I didn't trim down at all. And so from that photo, I started at the end of that photo that wasn't cut and then cut the one on the left. And I explained this more in the other video about panoramas. So whatever photo you don't trim, make sure the next cut lines up closest to that photo. So I hope that made sense. If not, you can ask questions below or go watch the other video. And I'm using this tool right here. If you are not familiar with it, this is the Quick Glance Guide, and it is really handy for hand cutting. You don't really need it for the dies, but if you're hand cutting, it's really nifty because you kind of get an idea of how your photo is going to cut. In this case, I'm using it because I'm figuring out which lines I need to cut along. So I'm using the top section because each of those squares represents, or not represents, they are 1 inch wide. And so I know where to align my ruler every time, because I don't have these lined up right on the 1 inch lines or the half lines. So I don't want to mess up. So it's easier for me to use the Quick Glance Guide to figure out where I should line up my ruler and cut on the next line. So that's how I'm using it right now. You can also use it to figure out how big you want to crop your photos, and so it's a really good tool if you're hand cutting. All right, I know I won't use that last strip, so I'm just going to take it off. So now everything is cut into 1 inch strips, and you want to make sure you have 10 all together for your panorama. And I definitely have more than 10, which is really nice. So now I have a little bit of an option of which ones I want to use. Now I use the Quick Glance Guide, so this bottom here goes up to 3 squares wide on the grid, and I use it to get an idea of where I want to cut on this panorama. So I chose a spot. I wanted to show a tiny bit of that rock. I won't get as much as I would like, but I also wanted to show a little bit of the sky in the background, because otherwise you can't hardly tell it's mountains if I don't have a little bit of the sky in there. So now I just cut, and you can discard this bottom section. You won't be needing that. All right, so now it looks nice and straight on the bottom. And now I'm going to bring back the quick glance guide because this way I know which line to cut on next. And I want to make sure it's the correct size to fit on the grid. And always double check where the ruler goes because when you have a really long cut like this, it's easy to think your ruler's aligned on the same line on the top and bottom. And then later you find out, oh, it accidentally shifted. So double check that your ruler is aligned on the same line on the top and bottom of your photo panorama. And now I'm discarding this piece here. And so now my panorama is the correct height to fit on the grid. So as you can see here, I was able to, even though I had multiple photographs, I fixed it so it's all aligned and will fit perfectly on the grid. All right, so I'm bringing back my layout and I have more than 10 strips, so I'm going to probably start with the left side because I want a little bit of that rock in there and the right side is not as interesting. So when you have more than 10 strips, you kind of need to decide on which direction you want to start with first and decide which one is more important to you. And then, like I'm doing now, I'm picking up each strip and lining it on the grid paper. And usually the glue is, you don't have to add any more glue because you already added glue on the back of the photos. But sometimes you may need to add extra because maybe you shifted the photo got cut in a way that there's not as much glue on the strip. Like this one. I cut on a part where there wasn't any, it got shifted over basically, and I didn't get any glue on that section. So I think this one's the same way. Of course, it could have been a photo I forgot to add glue to as well. So anyway, for the most part, you'll already have glue on the back of each strip, and you don't have to add any more to put it on the grid paper. So this is the first panorama, and I think it looks really nice. This was taken on the Blue Ridge Parkway, by the way. It's a beautiful place. All right, next, I'm going to make my second panorama. So yes, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I am having two panoramas on the same layout. And so this kind of panorama I'm doing, I did not show in my other videos, so this will kind of be a new idea I've not shown on YouTube, but it's very easy. So I'm going to fit it so they're 2 by 2 squares each. So on the grid, these squares are actually 2 1/8 by 2 1/8 inch. And the reason why I'm not cutting these at 2 1/8 inch is because the photos are 4 by 6, and so I would only be able to get one photo across because I have them going vertically, so it's 4 inches, and it would just be really awkward cuts, whereas I can cut these basically in half and get a 2-inch square, and if they were landscape, I could get 3 squares going in that direction. So just so you're aware, with this kind of size, it's a little bit harder to make them 2 1/8 by 2 1/8 because it makes it an awkward cut. If you want them to be purely photo, you may want to print them at 5 by 7. But I like the idea of having the mat behind the photo because sometimes if you mess up a little bit, the matting kind of disguises it. So anyway, I'm going to do the same steps as I did before, basically. So I'm going to have one photo that will not be cut at all, or at least trimmed down at all. Obviously, I'm going to cut it when I make the panorama parts. Anyway, I hope the idea of the 2 by 2 squares makes sense. Like I said, it just makes an awkward cut, so it's easier to just go ahead and make them 2 by 2. And 2 by 2 inches doesn't cover the measurements of the grid, so that's where the matting comes in. You have the mat cover up the grid, and then the photo can layer on top of that. So it's just because of the measurements of the photo themselves that makes it easier. All right, so I did the same thing as before. I have one photo that isn't cut, and there was some overlapping, so I took the overlap part off the other one. And to cover the bottom portion, you only need 5 squares. So really, the photo I did not trim down, that's going to basically be cut in half and make 2 squares. The one on the left I had to trim down, and so that'll make 1 square. And on the right over here, I didn't have any overlap, thank goodness. So it just needs to be cut in half as well. So if I had to, I had an extra photograph if I needed more. And what's nice about having the matting in between, because it would have been an awkward cut. So see here, it lines up, but I don't need that one. But if it was an awkward cut, having the gaps in between each square kind of disguises that maybe you had to skip over something. So if I had to trim that third photo on, or the last photo on the right now, awkwardly, and I had to use the fourth photo, it kind of would have made an awkward like transition because I wouldn't have been able to make it 2 by 2 exactly. So anyway, I hope that makes sense. If you were here in person, it would probably make more sense. So anyway, so thankfully it worked out. I can cut the 2 photos, the one in the middle and the one on the right, just in half. And the third one, like I said, I couldn't make 2 different squares, but I only need 5 altogether. So it works out. And like I said, if you mess up, that is what's nice about having the gaps in between each piece, is because it kind of disguises that for you. All right, so I'm going to cut this one. So it's 2 inches in width. So I don't need that extra piece. And the other 2, I don't need to cut in half right now. Right now, I'm going to just cut them at 2 inches in height. I had some glue on there. And then I realized I don't need to worry about the glue in that spot because I'm not going to keep it. So at the quick glance guide, if you want it to be exactly 2 by 2 inches, 1 by 1, or even bigger, 3 by 3, 4 by 4, you want to use the top section. So don't use the bottom section of the quick glance guide. Use the top section because those are all exactly 1 inch squares. So that's why I'm using the top section to get an idea of how 2 by 2 squares is going to look. So, and of course, since it is the mountains, I have a bit of the trees in there, and I wanted to show a little bit of the sky so you can tell that it's mountains in the background. I used a quick glance guide again because to know which line to cut on next. So already, this is going to be a perfect panorama. I think it looks really good. And now I just need to cut them all into 2 inch squares. So really I'm cutting the photos right in half, but I needed to know which lines to cut along the mat here. So that's why I'm using my quick glance guide. So this is a lot quicker. Really altogether I had to only cut 3 times in comparison to my previous panorama. But I wanted to show this today because there are multiple ways you can create panoramas with Mosaic Moments, and this is just one of the options. More, I'm sure, will come. You can make panoramas, believe it or not, with our specialty dies if you use them in a specific way. So you can make, that's what I love about Mosaic Moments. My favorite technique is the panoramas. Anyway, so at 2 by 2 inches, you get a very, very thin mat, but that's okay. So you don't have to have too much of a mat behind your photograph when you're making this kind of panorama. And as you can see, it lines up really well. So even though you have the background piece, you can see the panorama line up really well there, and it looks really good. All right, so this is my final panorama, and I'm going to go ahead and add the fir tree die. Maybe you remember I made that a while ago. I know this is a kind of a long video, but this is an optional thing, so I just want to show you can keep the panorama as it is, or you can add 2 by 2 dies on top of them. I'm going to add it on 2, and it's really nice because the panorama is still all aligned, even behind the fir tree dies. So I think that looks really good. You can even do it where there's 2 by 2 dies that cover all of the squares on the bottom. So here's the difference again. You can leave it as a panorama like this, or add the fir tree dies on top, and I'm going to go ahead and glue those down. Alright, here is my final layout. I really love how it turned out, and I love how you can fit 2 panoramas in one. When I went on this trip, I took a lot of photos of the mountains and not much of me. Like, this is literally all I have of myself. So I had a lot of scenic photos, and so using a double panorama is great if you just have a lot of those photos you want to use on a layout. And I hope you guys enjoyed watching the process. I know many of you like watching me create the pages, and I hope you guys learned a lot of tips and tricks in this video. If you have any more questions, please ask below. I love answering them. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you next time.